Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to see you here. This session, Read to Remember, looks at writing for children about war. War is a difficult topic, but as we know from Remembrance Day and current events, it's something that children know about and hear about in the media, and it's something that it's important to learn about from the past as well. We have three wonderful authors here to talk about this subject who have written fiction and nonfiction, exploring these themes, both wars of the past and wars of the present. On my right, we have Hugh Brewster, author and editor. He has written 15 books on subjects as diverse as the Titanic, World War I, World War II, and dinosaurs. On my immediate left is Ken Setterington, a librarian and author. He was the first children's and youth advocate for the Toronto Public Library. He is the author of seven books. And his most recent book was shortlisted for the TD Canadian Children's Literature Award, branded by the Pink Triangle. And to farther left is Deb Ellis, author of, who has a fan club here, no surprise, author of 27 books of fiction and nonfiction exploring really challenging and interesting topics for kids about war around the world and peace around the world and situations that children find themselves in. And the first question that I want to ask the panel, and I'm going to start on my right and move left, is why is it important to write about these topics for children, and what impact do you hope your books will have?
Well, thank you, Gillain. I approached war, first of all, as somebody interested in history. You know, when I was growing up in the 1950s and 60s, I was surrounded by boys who were fascinated by machine guns and airplanes and bombs and swastikas and all that kind of stuff, because the war was relatively recent, and they all found it terribly interesting, and I did not. I had zero interest in anything to do with the military. When I got into high school, it was a private school, and there was an enforced cadet corps that I hated. So, and then when I graduated, it was the 60s and peace and love and long hair, and we were, I cut my teeth opposing the Vietnam War and being very anti-war. And there was an assumption at the time that lasted for, almost 25 years after the 60s, that anything to do with war, commemorating war, remembering war, was somehow glorifying war. And some people still believe that. I do not. But as time went on, it became clear that if I was to write about history, particularly Canadian history, that war is just a huge part of our history. It's hard to avoid. And I was also shocked by how few Canadians knew anything about their history, and particularly the history of Canadians in World War I and World War II, the two great wars of the 20th century. And so I wrote a book for the 60th anniversary of Juno Beach after I read a newspaper article about a survey they'd done in Canada and asked people, do you know about Juno Beach? And virtually nobody in Canada did. They'd never heard about the beach that the Canadians seized on the day that helped bring about the end of Adolf Hitler. So I thought it was time to do something about that. And, the first book came out, and it was actually popular. It was a book, more than just a book for school. It was a book that children related to. And so since then, I've done several more. But I think it's essential to understand war, to understand the present. Now, Deborah writes about, present-day wars, so she would have a different answer, and I'll pass that on to her, or to Ken.
Whether or not we go to war, I think, is the most important decision that we make as human beings. It's the core of who we are. How are we going to treat each other? What are we going to leave for future generations? And war is kind of a concept that has no I mean, we talk about war as if, but we don't really get it as a concept of what it means. We honor our soldiers, Remembrance Day, and it's good that we do that. We leave out a huge part of it, though, so that it can feel to a child like it felt to me when I was a brownie marching in the Remembrance Day ceremonies, that war is just about uniforms and marching and poppies. And that means that there's a lot of the information goes missing, and we can't make proper decisions unless we have all the information that we need. That's why I think it's important to write about war and the effects of war and what those decisions mean to us as human beings.
Well, and I guess the only reason I wanted to write my my book about the war was really, it's the forgotten victims. And certainly war has such a devastating effect on so many, and we don't always remember all the people that suffered. And so I wanted to make sure that the men who were persecuted for being gay in Nazi Germany were remembered in a way, and the people didn't forget that there were many victims, and actually how far bullying can go. And so as bullying is as prevalent today as it was then, but I think Nazi Germany gives a really strong indication of just how far things can go off track.
And my next question, which is really extends from the first one, I suppose, is, Deb, you choose to write about present wars instead of past ones. What is it that makes you gravitate to writing about the things that are happening right now?
The first war I wrote about was when the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, and I did that as a way to try to raise some money so that I could be of use to the women in Afghanistan. And that kind of led me to writing about other wars. And again, it feels like we've learned a lot about war from World War I and World War II and Korea and Vietnam and all these other wars that have been going on. There's nothing left that we have to learn. So why is it still going on? It's not like there's something about it that we haven't figured out yet. So the fact that we're continuing to repeat the same bad decisions over and over again, I think that's why I choose to write about that.
My next question is about approaching this subject through fiction or nonfiction, because our authors here have used various ways. And I'll start with Hugh, who has written mostly nonfiction, but then was asked to write a fictional book, which was a real change for you in your writing about World War II. And why did you start with nonfiction, and what did you like about fiction when you got there, if you did?
Well, that's an excellent question. And it picks up from what Deb had to say about people in war, because that has always been what's interested me. And in fact, sometimes it's the editors or the publishers who encourage me to put in more about weapons or about, bombs or airplanes or violence, and they say, well, that's what boys like, they like Call of Duty and they like video games. So, and there's this cliche in children's writing that you have to grab them right at the start, particularly boy readers. You have to seize them by the throat on the first page or they're not going to be interested. And I always fight that because I don't think it's true. I think it's a very cliched way to approach things. And the boys who write to me, maybe they're like me, they're not so macho, but they always like the characters. And what fascinates them about war is, what would they do? What would they do if they found themselves in this situation, life or death situations, which I think fascinates young boys and girls to some extent, but young boys in particular are fascinated by how they would perform. How they would manage, how would they cope in very extreme situations. So I always try to establish the characters and so on. So to answer your question about fiction versus nonfiction, I had always figured I was just a historian and a nonfiction sort of person. So when I was asked to write a book for this new series that Scholastic was developing called I Am Canada, I just finished a nonfiction book about Dieppe. And I'd interviewed lots and lots of veterans, and the stories they'd told me had so haunted me. Most of them were very old men. My parents were veterans, and veterans don't talk. If you ask veterans about the war, they mostly don't want to talk. And only when they get to be old, in most cases, will they. And so I suddenly found myself speaking to 80 and 90-year-old men who would sometimes say to me, I've never told this to anyone. And I would be so moved, but I had many more of these stories than I could ever put in a 48-page nonfiction book. So when Scholastic said, would you write a novel for us about Canadian history, I immediately thought, I'm going to write about Dieppe, because the stories of not just that terrible day when 5,000 Canadians were ordered onto a beach to be either massacred or taken prisoner, something we still don't understand. They had told me so much about this, not just, as I say, about the day, but about the prison camp experiences that followed, and the tunnels and the escapes, all of which I knew, young people find terribly interesting, that I thought, yes, I could certainly do a novel about that, about Dieppe, and incorporate all those real-life stories that I've heard. And I'll be quick, writing fiction was so liberating, because in nonfiction, you're not supposed to invent dialogue. You're not supposed to put thoughts in people's heads. But I found that I was able to do all that, and it was hugely, hugely liberating. And to me, it made it even more truthful, because I could convey what they were thinking and what they were saying and what they were doing in a way that I simply couldn't in a nonfiction account, because people would think I was making stuff up, which I actually wasn't. So fiction can be realer than nonfiction.
Ken, when you wrote Branded by the Pink Triangle, you did it as nonfiction. Were you at all tempted to try fiction, or were there stories that you felt could become great fiction?
I think there's oodles of stories that could become great fiction. And the reason I decided, I was certainly given the opportunity to do either fiction or nonfiction, I decided that this was a story that really hadn't been told in a book for young readers. And I didn't want anyone to be able to question the truth in the story. And you can do that in fiction to a certain extent, but I wanted to make sure that the numbers were there, that the people that I talked about, the victims were real people. And I also knew that the book would get enough attention if it was good enough that people would see if there were flaws in it, if I was saying something that wasn't true. So I wanted to make sure that it was a book of truth that showed how the victims had suffered, who the victims were, and the stories themselves were powerful. And all of the people that I wrote about are dead, and they were dead when I wrote the book. So I couldn't interview them, I couldn't get any more information than what I could find in archives. But I thought for the topic that I had, it was important to at least have one book that could be cited as truth. And that doesn't mean that my next book isn't going to deal with the same topic in a fictional account, but I can give myself the freedom to do that now in a way that I didn't feel I could when I was writing Brandon.
And I think that freedom that you get with fiction is very interesting. And Deb, you have done countless books, and some are fiction and some are nonfiction. And how do you decide what a topic merits, or does it just come naturally out of it, or?
The kind of nonfiction books I do are books of interviews with people on the ground. So I'll go to Jordan to interview Iraqi refugees, or Israel and Palestine, and so on. And that's amazing, because I get to actually meet people and learn about what's happened to them and how that's affected them. The last book I've got out is called The Cat at the Wall, and it takes place in Israel and Palestine, and it's a novel. And I had intended to write another book of interviews with Israeli and Palestinian kids. The last time I was there, time before this, was like 10 years ago, and now I was back again, and I interviewed a lot of kids, and I still could not make head nor tail out of the situation there. It seemed too complicated. So the way I got into it was to have an interloper, a girl who's a North American teenager who got killed and reincarnated as a cat in Jerusalem, who ends up in the house of a Palestinian family that's taken over by some Israeli soldiers. And she knows nothing. And so she's got to figure out from what's going on based on the clues around her. And that's the only way I could kind of make head nor tail out of what was going on there.
That's interesting because Michael Morpurgo, who wrote War Horse, said when he wrote War Horse, he put an animal as the main character because he said, I wanted something that could be completely neutral, who could have no alliances. A child might have alliances to one side or the other, but so your cat is in many ways completely neutral. Now, I'll start back with you, Hugh. Okay. People often accuse, books for children of glorifying war, or I shouldn't say often accused, but there's always that kind of idea that you shouldn't glorify war, and that especially boys will think, oh, the tanks are cool, and I think you and I both come out of that same. I recognize that your description of the 60s, and you push war away, we don't talk about it, we don't think about it. So how do you tackle the subjects without in any way glorifying war?
Well, I think the sheer horror of war is something that is conveyed in everything that I write. And, having just spent weeks now talking about World War I, the absolutely, shocking loss of life and really appalling conditions. Now, obviously, you have to dial it back to some degree with children because you don't want to be gratuitously violent. And so you have to walk, I think, a delicate road. And I think, as I mentioned, the way to do that is through characters and real-life people, if it's nonfiction, but get their accounts and their descriptions of what it's like to survive, that kind of experience. So I think any book that accurately depicts war, as all three of us do, in no way glamorizes it or makes it seem attractive. And I always guard against gratuitously putting in, say, a violent opening or something like that to attract people. And I have to say that there are some people who still say that anything to do with war somehow glorifies it or celebrates it. And there was an article about this in a recent issue of Canada's History where Jonathan Vance, a noted historian, tackled this issue. And he said, when we commemorate the 1989 Montreal massacre, we're certainly not glorifying violence against women. That's the last thing that we're doing. It doesn't celebrate violence against women, quite the opposite. And I think in commemorating war, we do remember both the victims and the survivors, just as we do when we commemorate other tragedies. But I do think that it's an essential part of our history, and that it is not glorifying war to honor the men who made that sacrifice. Some people say, oh, they're all cannon fodder, Well, that just isn't so. When you read about these men, many of them felt that they were, fighting for liberty and freedom. Certainly in the Second War, they were opposing, the evil of Hitler. So, yes, war is human behavior at its most bestial. But one of the fascinating things is that sometimes in war, you find human behavior at its best. People who sacrifice themselves for others, who do extraordinary things, just extraordinary things. There is such a thing as valor. There is such a thing as heroism. These are old-fashioned words, but they exist, and I think it's not a bad thing for younger people to read about this.
And that, but the question I was going to ask afterwards was, how do you tackle the violence inherent in that topic? And you have discussed that too. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
No,
Getting ahead of
that's
you.
good. So Ken, you were tackling a very difficult subject with Branded by the Pink Triangle. How do you balance all that out, if you can, if balance is not the wrong word?
Well, I don't know what the right word is, But I think certainly, like, the question of violence is certainly there, because in my book I was certainly trying to show the horrors of the brutality that was these men had to endure. And how does one include that in a book for young readers? But there was a necessity to really make a reader aware of just how brutally these men were tortured, what happened to them, but yet not just have the book go on and on with brutality. As a kid, I remember my history book was called Fair Domain, and I think I could tell you that on page 245, there was this really brutal scene, and every kid knew that page. I didn't want the book for people to think, okay, you can turn here and find this torture, you can find it elsewhere. But I did want to make sure that there was enough there that people reading would care about these men enough that when they heard how horribly they were treated, it mattered to them. And I think that in interacting with the kids that I've been talking to, they were surprised, and having photos, and that's where nonfiction, I think, can help, that not the photos of brutality, but just the awareness that these things did take place.
And Deb, obviously you do a good job of not glorifying war, but some of your topics are very difficult, and some of the books, especially when you're interviewing children, they are making very strong statements, and you don't edit them, but that's a challenge in itself. How do you tackle what are very difficult subjects, both in fiction and nonfiction?
The children that I meet, that I interview, it's their words. So whatever their experience is, then that's what goes into the book. In a fictional sense, I try to keep it the same way. So my character is 12 years old. What would a 12-year-old understand in that situation? What would she see? What would she know? And how could she explain it to herself? The topic I haven't really touched on yet is child sexual abuse. I'm not sure that I could write about that. But I think that there are other writers who do, and I think that anything that happens to children, anything that we allow to happen to children around the world should be reflected in their literature in some way. May I just,
oh, yes.
One of the great things I like about Ken's book is that when children read it and they see the brutality against gay men by the Nazis, maybe that will make them think about slogans and words that they cast out loosely in their own hallways of the school, and make them think, well, maybe there's a link there. Maybe I shouldn't behave in this way. So.
And I want to ask you all three about your research process, because you do extraordinarily amounts of research. So I'm going to start in reverse, Deb, with you.
Okay.
You must travel a lot. You must read a lot.
Yeah, I get to travel to all these amazing places and meet with these incredible people and learn about their lives directly from them. So refugee camps, war zones, all that kind of place. Plus I do a lot of research as well.
And is there a different process for your fiction? Because it seems to me that essentially you'd have to do almost the same amount of work.
It's the same. It's the same,
okay.
yeah.
And Ken, how did you research the Pink Triangle book?
Well, certainly I spent a lot of time working in archives and certainly doing an awful lot of reading. But I think more than anything, going to Sachsenhausen in Germany, which was the concentration camp that was referred to as the Auschwitz for gay men. So it was just outside Berlin. And I went there on a brutally cold day. And what stunned me was how I could take a train from the center of a city to go to a concentration camp and walk from the train station to the camp with the understanding that everyone had said they didn't know what was happening in these camps, with the knowledge that thousands of men were shipped to this camp and basically no one left alive unless they were on a death march at the end of it. So as much as all the research I did walking through that camp on this cold day, knowing how I was standing there in a down-filled parka and I had heavy boots and a hat and gloves, and that men were sent out naked to stand for hours as punishment. Those stories came flooding into me without question. And I still get moved when I think of what happened in that camp. And if I hadn't been there, I don't know that I would have actually had the ability to write the book.
Amazing. And Hugh?
Well, I would say the same thing, that I usually spend my tiny advance going to the place, even if I've been there before. Even if I've been to the Western Front, I went back and tramped all around the Passchendaele battlefield. And of course, at Dieppe, I mean, when you stand on those beaches and see the pebbles that got stuck in the treads of the tanks, and you look up at the cliffs from which the enemy was firing down on the Canadians landing below, and you think, what were they thinking? I mean, how on earth could they expect people to make a landing here? And even if they're a few minutes late and the sun had come up, which is what happened, they could see them coming ashore and could simply fire down on them. And Blue Beach, which was just outside Dieppe, a vacation town called Puy, which is where the men from Toronto were to land, and they called it Blue Murder because they were almost all killed. It's been said there couldn't have been a worse place anywhere on the continent of Europe to have an assault landing than Blue Beach. So standing there, and of course, where I had a Ken-like experience was when I first went there, it was for the 60th anniversary, and so I stood there with veterans who were there for memorial services. And see, I'm getting emotional. When those very old men, when they played O Canada and those very old men saluted, it was one of the most moving experiences you could ever have, I think, as a Canadian, because it made it all very, very real. So, yeah, going to the place, I think, is key. And then in terms of research, World War II, I've been lucky enough to actually interview people, and that's been extraordinary, because many of them, as I mentioned, would say things that they'd never even talked about in 60 years. So that all forms very important research. And when there aren't people alive, then yes, you go to archives. And unfortunately, when you're a children's writer, there are lots of adult writers who have written about this, so you get to read all their work and then sift through and distill often from what others have done. So I stand on the shoulders of other historians, which I greatly appreciate.
Okay. And my final question, and then I hope people will ask questions, are there facts or stories that you have uncovered during your research? Well, you've already told us, I think, the ones you haven't been able to forget. Are there stories that didn't make it into your books, but that still you think about, that you would like to write about, or that you think you could never put in a book, but they're great stories anyway, and you can tell them here?
Do you want me to go first on that, or
actually,
Deborah?
That's not fair. Why don't I?
Too many stories of such great brutality that I couldn't put them in a book.
Yeah. Wow.
I would have to say the same, that while working through all the research and you find a story and then think, there's just no way that I can include this because it's just too hard.
Wow.
And that, and I'd have to say, as much as stories of kindness were such a delight to find, but in the topic that I had, there was only one story that I could find that had any kindness attached to it.
Well, in talking to these old men, many of them were randy young men when they went to war, and they were only too happy to tell me stories that I could never put in in a children's book. I mean, if you wonder why there are so many war brides who came over after the war, well, the brides were the ones they married, but 18, 19, 20-year-old men who think they're about to die, there was a lot of sex going going on. Obviously, more than I could ever. I see the younger children have gone. More than I could ever put in a book for young readers. And I could just think of one story that a Dieppe veteran told me after they were. In the most severe prison camps, later in the war, many of them were farmed out to sort of work camps, and they worked on farms, and there was the proverbial farmer's daughter, of course. But there's one particular veteran ended up having an affair with a girl in the village. He was locked up at night, but he could sneak out. He ended up having an affair with the local SS man's daughter, and was upstairs when Dad came home, in his SS uniform, and, how he ever got away with this, and what would have happened to him if he'd been discovered in bed with, the daughter of the local SS guy. I don't know. But, yeah, so lots of stories about sex that I sadly couldn't include.
This is a question for the two gentlemen and you in the green. Okay. If you could be a cake, what kind of cake would you be? Yes.
I'll answer that. You answer. I have a really easy answer. I'm a diabetic, so it would have to be sugar-free.
Probably a fruit cake.
I would only have to be the cake that I would really want to eat, and so it would have to be a chocolate cake. Just.
Okay. There are other questions. Yes, Anne.
Firstly, I also want to thank you for your strength and your devotion in writing about these really hard topics. And for myself, I'm writing about some tough stuff too. So how do you renew yourselves? How do you rejoice in life? What do you do when you're in the middle of researching and writing these really tough subjects? I'm contemplating writing a book now, and I started doing the research, and I thought, I can't do it. I can't emotionally do it right now. So what do you do? What do you guys do?
Thank you, Anne. I should mention that's Anne Dublin, who is the author of a number of wonderful books. So let's start with Deb.
I become separate. I separate myself from the things that I'm writing about, and then any emotions that I have about it, I deal with later. The people that I meet have had far worse lives than I will ever have, and they get up every morning and they try to make it better. So they keep going. So I figure I can keep going.
I'd simply say I am not able to separate as easily, and I can say that I spent many tearful moments in front of the computer, and I got blindly drunk when I came back from Sachsenhausen concentration camp. That just really was an incredibly difficult trip for me. But what I really do try to think is, okay, is this important enough to write? Do I really want to do this? And that's what gets me through continuing.
Hugh. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm a big weeper too. I sit there, and tears run down my face, as I'm typing away. But fortunately, some of the recent books I've done, the characters survive. So there is that. They survive. They overcome. And you think of how, if you think of the horror of the great wars of the 20th century, and that although we continue to have war, some of the horrors of those wars are past, and so there is that. But I have to say, back to the fiction question, the most upset I ever got was when I had to kill off a fictional character. That upset me for days, because I used to hear fiction writers talk about their characters and how they got up with their character, got very involved with their characters, and I would always roll my eyes and think, oh brother, I mean, come on, you just make them up, why do you care? But yeah, killing off in war this one particular character to whom I was very attached. It was like I had actually lost somebody. You know, I walked around for days, you know, grieving for that person. Now he was based on a real person, and when the real veteran died, I was asked to speak at his funeral, and so I read from the book Prisoner of Dieppe for the first time at the funeral, and people were very moved, and I had to bite my lip 16 ways, you know, to get through that. But I don't know. There's something uplifting in writing about these things. It's depressing, and yet, you know, there's always something that inspires you about human resilience and the human spirit, and that's what makes it sort of worthwhile. If that's not corny and cliched, but.
Another question? Okay. Hugh, when you were... Oh, okay. Yes?
I was just wondering what you're each working on next. What your next project is.
What your next project is. Okay, Hugh, what's your next project?
I don't know. For the first time in my rather long life, I don't know exactly, and it's very nice to not know. I have all these ideas floating around, at least 6 or 7, and you know, now that I'm getting a little long in the tooth, I want to do things that I haven't done before because, you know, I may not get the chance. So I have 2 plays that I wrote, and I don't know what to do with them, but I'd like to see something happen with them. I've been asked to curate a museum show that came out of one of my books, which is kind of interesting. And I have several fiction and non-fictional ideas that, depending on what day it is at the moment, I think I'll tackle next. But right this fall, I've been promoting my From Vimy to Victory book, so I haven't had time to do anything else. But I'm enjoying, you know, sort of not knowing what comes next.
Ken?
Well, on those nights when I can't fall asleep, I plot out any number of different books. So I've got a number of major attempts on a variety of novels that are in the works. And it just depends on, you know, what I wake up to after thinking the night before.
Deb?
I'm thinking of going to visit some mental hospitals around the world. I think that would be kind of interesting.
Wow.
To look at the state of how we view people with mental illness around the world.
Right. Well, I'd like to thank everyone very much for this. The authors, we do have a little more time, but if you would like to chat with the authors individually, that would be great, and they will be available for signing at the signing session over there. Hugh, when you were talking about the stories, I was reminded my grandmother and great-grandmother spent the First World War in London, England. And the very first time it was a time of great, you know, jingoism, and we're getting the enemy, and, you know, all the kinds of things that drove people into a war that was a senseless slaughter. And my great-grandmother was a very smart woman, and she recognized a lot of that jingoism and that this idea that war was just wonderful and heroic. And the first time that aerial bombs were dropped on London, my grandmother, dutifully, in the air raid warnings, went down to the basement, and she couldn't find her mother. And when she came out afterwards, she said, "Where were you?" And her mother said, "I was up on the roof watching." And my grandmother said, "Weren't you afraid?" And my great-grandmother said, "I was so delighted because now people here will realize what war is really about." And unfortunately, they didn't. But she really felt that, you know, everybody who was thinking the war was a grand thing, suddenly when they were bombed themselves might realize. But I think all these authors here and the wonderful authors who are writing about war do a great deal to try to bring to young readers an understanding of war, an understanding of the causes, an understanding of the tragedy, and maybe the little elements of hope. And I'd really like the people in the audience, I would really like to thank you all for what you do.